This morning, we have members from Sulio. First, we have Mr. Casper Castra, Mr. Patrice Héroux, and Mr. Marc Poisson. You have up to 7 minutes, since you are the only witnesses today, after which we'll pass to questions. I will signal when you have only a minute left, so please keep an eye on me. Thank you very much for your witness testimony. Now on to the witnesses. So you have 7 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and ladies and gentlemen of the committee. Good morning. As Executive Vice President of Sulio Cooperative Group and Chief Executive Officer of Sulio Agriculture, I thank you for allowing me to address you today. I am accompanied by Mr. Patrice Héroux and Mr. Marc Poisson, respectively Vice President, Finance and Director of Public and Government Affairs. Sulio Cooperative Group has been around for over 100 years and is the largest pan-Canadian agricultural cooperative with Quebec roots. Sulio Cooperative Group represents more than 123,000 members, agricultural producers and consumers grouped in 48 traditional agricultural and consumer cooperatives. We have more than 15,000 employees within our 3 divisions, including Olimel, specializing in pork and poultry meat processing, and BMR, a Quebec leader in retailing construction materials and hardware.
Division supports producers in Eastern Canada to help them maximize their yields by specializing in the marketing of agricultural inputs and value-added agronomic services. As a federation of cooperatives, ensuring the supply of inputs required by producers for their various production activity at the farm is both the core of our business and an obligation. We depend on imports, and the large quantities of fertilizer required by producers for their brief spring period cannot be all stored in advance. This explains the maintenance of some of our supply contracts, which were concluded before the sanctions were imposed, to honor past orders and guarantee the availability of fertilizer to producers during the key planting period. Nevertheless, the withdrawal of the most favored nation tariff treatment for imports from Russia and Belarus required the payment of 35% duties on many of our shipments, amounting in total to $33.5 million. And certainly the severity of the atrocities that were committed by Russia and ongoing against the Ukrainian people demanded a strong and severe response from Canada. However, those sanctions must have an effect on Russia, not on Canada, and this is why we have undertaken the appeals that bring us here today for 3 of the shipments, representing 7 customs transactions in total, as they were in transit to Canada before the sanctions were imposed. On April 13, 2023, the Canada Border Services Agency approved the modification of the tariff treatment on our first 2 review requests, which resulted in a refund of $7.8 million, which was then redistributed in the following weeks in accordance with our commitment to producers. Then at the beginning of this year, we were notified of a review of the 2 decisions that led to the $7.8 million refund, only to be told last March, 11 months later, that the agency was reversing its decision and that we had to return this amount, already redistributed to producers, adding interest representing an amount of $395,000. That is what we did in order to be able to appeal these 7 decisions. And to date, this is a burden of $35.3 million that remains unacceptable for producers in Eastern Canada. It is equally unacceptable from our point of view that producers in Eastern Canada have been at a competitive disadvantage since March 2022 compared to those elsewhere in the world, including the United States, given the dependence on imports. And speaking of the United States, I would like to point out that it still sources from Russia despite its position against the war in Ukraine. Unfortunately, the affordable price, quality, and quantity available of Russian fertilizers are difficult to source elsewhere. Canada does depend on fertilizer imports. We do not produce enough nitrogen to meet our needs, and we simply do not have any domestic production of phosphorus. Other countries with similar restrictions compete with us in sourcing from markets where available volumes are lower and located in regions with high geopolitical tensions, such as the Black Sea or the Middle East. We are not immune to a destabilizing event that would force us to reconsider Russia as a supplier, whether we like it or not. And what needs to be remembered here is that it will be difficult to guarantee supply given the restrictions, availability, and prices, and that agriculture production and food security in Canada could be weakened as a result. In conclusion, I thank you for your attention and the interest you give to these issues that closely affect producers across Canada. Merci.
Donc, merci pour votre présentation.
Thank you for your opening remarks. Incredible. You did that in 4 minutes, 41 seconds. You're so good at that. We will proceed to the question period. Now on to Mr. Lew for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here this morning. First question. You mentioned that 40% of fertilizer comes from Russia. There's a tariff on them that was imposed without having consulted those affected. Of course, we know that you are the major distributor for the east of Canada. In your opinion, there are not that many sources to begin with, so it was you're kind of in a sticky situation, if I understand correctly, because you're distributing to the east of Canada. That's correct. I will respond directly to Mr. Lew. Is that all right? I would like to answer in English. That's my mother tongue.
Yes, in fact, we do have difficulty in sourcing from various regions other than Russia. There are limited production in regions around the world. Most of the production of fertilizer is concentrated in areas where there are low energy costs, and we do see in certain of those situations where there's instability in those regions. In particular, the imposition of the tariff in 2022 was challenging for us because it arrived just several weeks before we needed to begin our seeding process. And normally, because we import a large number of vessels into Eastern Canada every spring, that takes anywhere from 2 to 3 months in preparation. So for us to be able to source the quantity of fertilizer that was already on order, already in transit, and to find alternative source was simply not possible for the full amount.
Okay. Merci. Et ce que je comprends aussi, c'est...
Thank you. So if I understand correctly, the $33.7 million of tariffs that were imposed on you, something like $7.8 million were actually reimbursed, but then months later they asked you to pay that same sum back. But you had reimbursed the producers directly. Do you know why they asked you for that money back?
To fully understand what the rationale was for the demand to return the sums that were already reimbursed. However, it is our understanding that it's fully within the rights of CBSA to proceed to that review and to ask for repayment. However, it is true that we did reimburse the full amount of the funds back to the various networks and producers that were impacted by these tariffs, and it was returned in the weeks following. Yes.
Monsieur Castro, ce qui veut dire qu'actuellement...
That means that right now you are shouldering the burden of that $7.6 million. It's Solio is shouldering that burden, correct?
Que vous aviez mentionné au départ, effectivement.
Plus the interest that you mentioned previously, correct? Yes. Let's look at what's happening to the United States. They've never imposed such tariffs. What do you think of the impact that would have on the agriculture in the east of Canada and our competitiveness on world markets when our major competitor doesn't do the same thing, especially since they are also involved in the war against the war on Ukraine.
Ready access to Russian fertilizer to be imported into their markets as well. North America in total is a net importer of nitrogen products and phosphate products, and that includes the U.S., that includes ourselves. It's been like that for quite a large period of time. For sure, we're a net exporter of potash products, and so there's really no real concerns about security or supply security in that case. What we've seen is that the U.S. has significantly increased their imports of Russian fertilizer since the arrival of the war in Ukraine. So they've more than doubled the amount of fertilizer that's been imported from Russia into their country. And they've also increased the amount of exports. So there's a lot of trade and commerce that's going back and forth where there are no restrictions on full and fair trade. In our case, the impact to producers in eastern Canada, we can estimate that there has been an increase in cost to producers as a result of limited access from all regions across the world. However, the bigger risk is actually if there were to be an interruption in supply in any other available source or region of the world, that would put us at significant risk because the number of options is quite limited. And we can think of the conflict in the Middle East as an example that would be a high-risk scenario.
And of course, the red tape that was necessary for your company to undertake means that you had to, get involved in all this paperwork that gets in the way of, just trying to be efficient. I don't know that, going through all this paperwork would be helpful at all. Very quickly, please. Yes, indeed. There were a lot of documents administratively and financially with regards to invoicing and so on that we had to fill out. The objective of the sanctions was not met. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Lehoux. Now on to Mr. Drouin for 6 minutes. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for being here with us. I don't want to talk about Russia because I think that this is an argument that doesn't lead anywhere. I don't want to talk about storing capacity either because depending on who you talk to, some people can store their goods for 1 year. And for example, in my riding, there is a supplier who actually got ready for this. It is the CBSA's right to ask for a reimbursement, but I do think that it is strange that they would give you a remission. So they said that you were correct, they reimbursed you, and then 11 months later they said, well, actually we were wrong and we'd like to get that money back. They told you that you were being refunded, and then 11 months later, did they speak to you in the meantime? Or did they stop talking to you afterwards? What was that like?
Indication early in the year, in January, I believe it was, that it was under review. In parallel, because we had submitted requests for reimbursement for 3 vessels total, which is 7 import permits in total. So we had received the reimbursement for 2 of those, and then subsequently applied for the other 5. And at that moment, or shortly thereafter, was when we were advised that the first 2 were now under review.
D'accord. Puis, c'est en revue à son...
So it's under review, but did they give you a deadline? Or that's it, and they'll just review it until Santa Claus comes through town? Well, right now we're doing a lot of follow-ups, and the answer is we'll get back to you shortly. So there is no proper deadline to get an answer. What was the argument that they gave you, other than the fact that they have the right to do it? Did they give you a valid reason for, making a different decision or changing their minds? So there's the retraction of a certain tariff that was put in place on March 2nd to October 7, 2022, and that imposed sanctions of about 35%. And then there's another exemption for certain products. Of course, we contest the tariffs because there were goods that were actually in transit in Canada before March 2022. But this is considered but this is lumped into a different category, even though fertilizer doesn't count as the same kind of goods. So let's say the agency, the CBSA, doesn't actually refund you these funds. What will you do? Can you go to court? What is Solio considering? Well, the sums are very large, and so, of course, we will continue to look into any means possible to get those funds back. As mentioned, there are various things we are looking into. Mr. Poisson, I just want to understand clearly. The CBSA is saying that transit isn't important to them. If it hasn't reached Canada, if it hasn't come to Canada, if it's not on Canadian soil at our ports, in our waters, then it's not considered to be a transit. Is that correct? It's not quite that. There was a boat that was considered to be in transit because it was really on the water at the time. I'll reiterate. From the CBSA's point of view, there was an exemption for certain goods. And the initial decree said that there was a sanction on Russian goods, and the second one gave an exemption. So it's very technical. Well, that's why we're here. Of course, our colleagues have asked certain questions, and the CBSA will be here after you, and we'll be able to get to the bottom of this. We want to avoid escalation, and we hope to reach a positive conclusion for you and for our farmers. Mr. Chair, do I have any time? One more minute. So the decree is there. Let's talk about Solio's future. You also have a partnership with Agromart.
You've mentioned the difficulty of sourcing elsewhere from Russia, given and you're worried about the conflicts in the Middle East. So from your perspective, you're seeing that the global marketplace is it's shrinking. The options are shrinking to look for other places to source. Is that your analysis?
Yeah, and I could give you a more concrete example of phosphate is a clear example. So we saw some hurricanes recently in the Florida area. It's a primary production region. Other key regions include Morocco and Russia itself. And so without Russia as an option, when there is an interruption in supply, then the option becomes very limited for other regions. And given the time that's involved to
Monsieur Castra, merci le temps pour.
Mr. Castra, Mr. Drouin's time has run out, but you're quite lucky because it's my turn now, and I will let you finish your answer.
Merci beaucoup. And simply to say that yes, those limited options. So we're at more risk of supply shock if any of those regions are shut down for whatever reason. Yeah. Merci.
Vous avez quand même identifié des.
You did identify some new procurement sources in North Africa, did you not?
Algeria is an example. Turkmenistan. There are other countries in the world that produce urea for sure. And in those circumstances, we see that the trade balance has evolved, where other countries that are still able to import from Russia, such as the U.S., India, or others, are taking up some of that production, which liberates volume that's produced in other regions of the world for us to be able to source directly. So it's really changed the trade flow in those cases.
Juste apportant complémentaire.
I'd just like to add something. There are other markets where we can source fertilizer, but we're not talking about the same quantities. We're talking about quality, quantity, and price, as mentioned in the opening remarks. These are not features that we necessarily find in these other markets. The way procurement works historically is that boats come to the Saint Laurent at a specific time of the year during the specific season, and the boats are actually floating storage units in a way. So we do have some extra storage, but it is limited because we are the biggest player in the east of the country, and so it does have an impact on our logistics because we are trying to have the right amount at the right time. There was a document that we submitted this morning to the committee that explains the evolution of the season, of the length of the season, and we're talking about how it's been shortening. It's a very critical timing situation. So if I understand correctly, that the geopolitical situation is not getting any better, and so this will be the status quo for a while. It's not a viable solution or situation for the east of Canada.
With limited options. The more that we limit options, various supply sources, our risk increases. The cost is also higher because Russia to eastern Canada is a cheaper supply source in terms of transit, and it also, as Mark had mentioned, it also improves our ability to have the product there when we need it. So when we have to source from other regions, it really just increases the risk of availability as well as the cost of supply to eastern Canada.
OK. Si on revient sur le fond de
So here's what you're contesting. How much did you pay in total in tariffs on Russian fertilizer? That's $33.5 million. And out of that $33.5 million, there was $7.8 million that you were exempted from because those boats had already left Russia when the tariff was imposed. You received that money. You redistributed that money to your clients who had paid those fees. And a year later, or 11, 10, 12 months later, the CBSA gets in touch and says, actually, you have to pay that fee back and those amounts back. And there's an interest, there are interest fees on top of it. This seems like a horrific process. I'd like to have more details. So you haven't, of course, been able to get refund from your clients that you credited. So that's my first question. And second question is, what situation does that put you in with regards to the future and your company? When you sign a contract, things are sure, and that allows you to predict your investments in other sectors, for example. So I'd like you to tell us about the uncertainty that was created by this situation and what you are recommending to the committee.
Peut-être débuter, en fait.
I'd like to start. We did refund that over $7 million. 11 months later, we refunded the CBSA plus interest. And of course, we were very uncomfortable asking for our clients to reimburse that. So we have taken on that charge.
To that, when we talk of Solio agriculture, obviously for us, that means that the producers themselves are impacted by that. We're a cooperative, and so the producers themselves, as owners, are the ones who are experiencing that cost and that loss. I think to answer your second question, or to speak to it, a couple of things that we found difficult with the situation were really the timing of the decision and the impact that it had on our ability to supply our farm clients just prior to the spring period. The supply chain is so long and extensive that to do so in a matter of weeks, to be able to pivot and find other sources. At the time, we had 8 vessels ordered from Russia. We were able to find replacement for 2, but we really had no other choice but to bring in the other 6 at that point in time. So timing is very important in those cases.
Si vous permettez, chose qui est
I'd like to add very briefly, Mr. Poisson. Here's one thing that's sure. Mr. Castra mentioned earlier that there is uncertainty with regards to procurement. We are not sure that we'll be able to access various markets. The committee, in its report on food security, which Mr. Castro participated in as a witness, it was mentioned that the committee wanted to look into potentially reviewing such decisions. Mr. Poisson, I'm sorry, I promised my colleagues I would not go over time. So 6 minutes to Mr. Canning's. Mr. Poisson, we could talk about that later.
Well, thank you, and thank you for being here today. I just want to clarify a few things or just set things. These are not sanctions. These are removal of best most favored nation treatments, so the tariffs go up 35%. So there's a 35% added cost to you and your customers. That's correct when you're importing from Russia?
That's correct. There were sanctions on specific vessel owners and things like that, which limited our flexibility of bringing product in. But it's also true that technically we could import the fertilizer today with a 35% tariff added. Yeah.
Right. And, you operate primarily or solely in Eastern Canada.
If I can respond, no. Actually, we also operate in Western Canada. Okay. We have a series of distribution and supply chain in that region as well. Yes.
And is it any better? Are there any? I guess from the national side of things, from Canadian imports, is there any better opportunities for Western Canada operators? I'm from British Columbia, so are there Asian options that are available there? I'm just trying to paint this sort of broader picture here.
Very fair question. In particular, China is significant. It's, I believe, the biggest user of fertilizer products globally. It's also one of the biggest producers as well. But what we've seen, particularly in the period following the pandemic, was a significant amount of export restrictions put in place, primarily for phosphate and nitrogen products. And so that limited their ability to supply regions of the world. But certainly it is an option to bring in product from the Asian market from time to time into the western region of the U.S. and in Canada. That's correct.
And as you said, North America itself, I think especially for phosphorus, is not a...
There's no domestic production in Canada of phosphorus. Right. There had been historically at times, both in Western Canada and Northern Ontario. There do remain phosphate reserves, but they're undeveloped at this point in time. So we depend 100% for all farming production and farming activity across Canada on imports of phosphate, whether west or east. And we are a significant nitrogen producer. However, we are a net importer in total. We don't have enough domestic production of nitrogen for all of farming needs across Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I know there is a big fertilizer plant in my riding in Trail that does produce, as I understand it, nitrogen fertilizers or ammonia-based products from the Tech smelter in Trail. But what you're saying is, operations like that within Canada and the United States are not enough to...
Certainly not enough. I believe the specific production that you're referencing would be an ammonium sulfate product, right. And so it's a nuance of a nitrogen product, but it is nitrogen production, but certainly would not be enough to supply all requirements.
And so I think I read here that Russia traditionally has supplied 40% of our fertilizer.
Into Eastern Canada, that is correct, yes. Okay. Yeah.
And when, obviously you mentioned that prices had gone up, have they gone up sort of to match that 35%? Is that how prices have reacted, or how much have prices gone up because of the increased demand elsewhere?
The impact on prices, it fluctuates like any commodity market would due to a large number of different reasons. And so at that time, there was a reaction in terms of replacement cost on fertilizer had gone up quite significantly, even surpassing the 35% that was imposed. But that would have been for a short period of time. And so pricing has, it's not reflective of the 35% tariff into Eastern Canada specifically any longer. It really is that we can't depend on supply from Russia, which traditionally has been a lower cost source, and now have to source from other higher cost regions and then higher cost of transportation to bring it into our market.
So it's not like those other suppliers are charging more, it's just that they always have cost more for the product plus the
our least cost option is no longer available, and now we have to go to the next higher cost options afterwards. That's correct.
And I just had a note down here, the low energy costs, you're saying that's where, is that the driving issue in fertilizer production? Is that energy cost to the electricity cost to
Yes, it's one of the biggest. I could go into long detail on that, but I won't. But in any case, yes, typically there is energy requirement to convert nitrogen from the atmosphere to a usable form that plants can take up, and that's what influences the construction of fertilizer production around lower cost gas cost or energy cost regions of the world.
Okay, I mean, just as an aside, I mean, that's why the tech smelter is in Trail is because of...
Monsieur Canning, on est au temps.
Mr. Canning's time is up. So 5 minutes to Ms. Rude.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. So I just want to go back to this, the shipments and the tariffs issue we were talking about. I come from Southern Ontario, and we have a lot of farmers that use your services. You mentioned that you had 3 shipments in transit. The government approved a refund of $7.8 million. So did you receive that refund back from the government once they approved it?
Absolument. Nous avons reçu les sommes, là, le 7.
Absolutely. We got the $7.8 million. The same amount was redistributed to farmers as we'd agreed to, and it was proportional to the initial tariff that had been distributed.
So the government authorized and gave you the $7.8 million refund, and you then in turn gave it back to the farmers, which was the right thing to do. But if I understand correctly, the CBSA has asked now for that refund back that you had already distributed to farmers. And on top of that, the CBSA is asking you for interest payments, and they're the ones who gave you the authorization for the refund and refunded the money. Is that correct?
Absolument.
Absolutely. 11 months later, we received a notice from the CBSA requiring us to refund the $7.8 million with interest amounting to $339 million, $395,000, apologies.
Producers and the cost of their production right now.
I'll field that one. Technically, our organization is fielding the full amount of the tariff, 7.8 plus the interest repaid, and our organization being owned by farmers means that it impacts their results as owners of the cooperative. The impact for us is really it limits our ability to reinvest in ongoing business activity, in improvements in basic business functions, trying to improve productivity. Investing in technology, those are funds that we would certainly deploy to better use than what we believe they're being used for today.
And obviously, fertilizer is an essential input for many crops, and especially where I come from in southwestern Ontario. So how have these tariffs contributed to higher food prices for Canadian consumers? And what does this mean for food sovereignty in Canada? I know you alluded to this earlier, that the tariffs are contributing to decisions made by your own organization, but is it contributing to decisions by farmers to reduce their production capacity at all? And what does that mean for food price stability?
La question est intéressante parce que ça ramène la prémisse.
It's an interesting question. We talk about it reminds us of special permits that we received in order to allow 4 of our boats to enter the port. Some of them were not allowed to come to port because they had Russian merchandise and they couldn't offload their goods. So it took some time before they were able to do that. For us, there seems to be a contradiction. We're maintaining this tariff even though we know that these goods are necessary for the food safety across the country. So there's something that doesn't make sense there. On top of that, right now, Canada allows Russian aluminum of a specific grade to enter Canada in order to fuel the aerospace industry. So I'd like to know why that's more important than our industry.
Thank you. That's a very good point. We'd like to ask the same questions, same question to the officials in the next hour. How do the fertilizer tariffs exacerbate the trend of reduced investment in Canadian agriculture, and what does that mean for the sector's future resilience and innovation?
I think the amount that was deployed and paid certainly is a direct impact of funds that can be used for other areas in terms of either finding alternatives for new technology to help reduce reliance on imports from other regions of the world. But those are funds that certainly could be used elsewhere to improve investment either at the farm level or through the supply chain, for sure.
Thank you very much.
Madame Rood.
Thank you, Ms. Rood and Mr. Castra. We have 5 minutes for Mr. Lewis.
Merci, monsieur. Thank you for being here today. I do appreciate this. You'd mentioned in your opening statements that Eastern Canadian farmers, especially in Ontario, where I am, are disproportionately affected by these tariffs, and about 85% of the nitrogen fertilizer used in the region is imported from Russia. Ultimately, today farmers are looking for predictability, they're looking for stability, and then their supply of fertilizers to ensure that they can plant effectively for future. We mentioned that, again, in Ontario, about 40% of the nitrogen comes from Russia, but I just wanted to confirm, Canada produces the potassium we need. We're self-sufficient in potassium. And as far as the phosphorus, we mostly rely on the United States for phosphorus? What countries are we?
So the major supply sources for phosphorus have been traditionally the U.S. from the Central Florida region. We continue to supply the Eastern Canadian and Canadian market from that region. Morocco is also a very significant and source of imports for Canada as well.
Okay. And so today we're speaking, farmers are considering the nitrogen products. I wanted to talk about the nitrogen protection products and procedures that can help, because one of the ways we can do this, and farmers are looking for, well, that every dollar invested in fertilization should be paid off. So we're talking about help with volatilization, help with leaching, help with denitrification. Are you working with farmers to help them reduce those uses of nitrogen, which not only takes our reliance off of those fertilizers, but is also saving them money?
Thank you for the question. It's relevant for us because we recently invested in partnership with a firm from the U.S. In a reduced release technology fertilizer to be applied to traditional fertilizer products. So we recently invested over $20 million in a coating facility in St. Thomas in Ontario, and that's a clear example of the commitment we have to find ways to improve fertilizer and nutrient use efficiency.
Do you have numbers or report that you can share with us? Is something as far as the success of that? Maybe Monsieur Poisson.
Je vais simplement indiquer, on a dans le fond une étude qui est en cours.
There is a study that we're undertaking with McGill University in Quebec in order to monitor the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and those fertilizers that emit in a controlled way. So we will surely be able to share that data with you once it's completed.
I would add, though, that there are some public information available that indicate that greenhouse gas emissions are significantly reduced in as much as 30% by the use of controlled release fertilizer products or nitrogen inhibited products. So our estimation is that the results of those tests that we have currently underway should validate that.
Thank you. And like I said, we're looking to help the farmers in more ways than one. We've talked about it, but Solio, Agrimart, others in the industry have obviously been exploring other sources of fertilizers that will reduce our dependency on Russian imports. What is your long-term strategy to ensure that fertilizer supply stability without relying on politically unstable regions?
So a couple of key areas. One for sure is what we just mentioned, improving nutrient use efficiency to ensure that what's applied to the field is taken up by the plants and so that it's used and directly inputted into the production at the farm level. And that's reduces waste and it benefits farmers, it benefits everybody by focusing on different technology and practices in those cases. We're not a direct manufacturer, but we do support manufacturer efforts to have more domestic production, certainly here in Canada, of fertilizer products that we use and or in other safe regions of the world, including the U.S. and adjacent countries.
I appreciate that. And I think everyone at this table is looking out for our farmers, including you, and I appreciate that. These stability issues, obviously global. You mentioned extreme weather. You mentioned geopolitical issues. Are you looking at other countries, other companies? Are you working together, basically, globally, to try and solve this problem?
So, short answer is yes. I think there, as I mentioned earlier, there are limited regions of the world where fertilizer is produced and manufactured, which necessitates or increases the risk for supply wherever it's consumed globally. But we do work actively in finding alternative sources, alternative technologies to help minimize that risk, and/or finding alternative sources globally.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis and Mr. Castra. Now, on to myself for 2.5 minutes. So here's my main question. What is the long-term impact of this on food security across the country and the cost of food? Because production costs, of course, have an impact on the goods in stores, but this is an amount of money that should be refunded to you. The imposition of a tariff and changing procurement sources, for example, creates an imbalance across the country. I'll answer first, and Mr. Castra can follow up. So we have to look at things differently. We're talking about commodities. Producers need insurance, and they need to have them at the same price that their competitors are paying for them. Otherwise, their profit margins are lower. So you can't pass off that surplus of cost to the final consumer, but that producer is going to struggle with that profit margin. And that's where the issue is. There is disloyal competition that is, very frequent across the country right now. I have nothing to add to that. So when you speak of special permits, of Russian aluminum, do you think that there is a double standard here? Agriculture is taken for granted, it seems. Maybe just some thoughts on that, 45 seconds.
Focus really my response on the situation that occurred in 2022 with the arrival of the tariffs. I think that there was a general lack of understanding of the impact that it would have, and if that had been clearly understood at that time, we believe there would have been different decisions taken at that moment in time. So I think in that case, it is safe to say that would be taken for granted. Marc, veux-tu ajouter?
Peut-être préciser, là, nous,
Anything to add? We received some help for the special permits, but Agri-Food Company Canada understood the issues, but we had a lot of support from that department, and we avoided a shortage.
I think I'll just follow up on that by saying, the removal of most favored nation status, was, I imagine, an attempt to put some pressure on Russia as part of a suite of things Canada and other countries were doing regarding their invasion of Ukraine. And the whole aim of it, I assume, would be to eliminate or significantly reduce Russia's ability to sell their products around the world. Can you just tell me how successful that has been? Is Russia now not able to sell those products? And both here, if you could maybe try to, I haven't heard any statistics on how much that has been reduced in Canada and, say, North America. How successful has this been? Because that's the whole point of these tariffs, is not to punish Canadian farmers. It's to punish Russia and stop their imports.
It's a very relevant question. For sure, there is little to no Russian fertilizer that has been imported into Canada since the imposition of the tariffs in 2022. So that has had an impact on Canada in that sense that we no longer have been accessing or access Russian fertilizer products. Russia, for its part, although not having access to Canada is true, has no problem finding sources or individuals or countries that would be willing to take their product, including the U.S., which is fully free and able to import from Russia. But that same could be said for many countries around the world who do continue to import from Russia. So the impact to them has been negligible, if anything at all.
So, and as you say, the American agriculture industry continues to import Russian fertilizer without, been no diminution there.
There's been no reduction, and you'll find in the document that you'll receive afterwards, which indicates statistics of how much their imports of Russian fertilizer products has actually increased very significantly since the invasion of Ukraine.
Monsieur Canning, merci, Monsieur Castra.
Thank you to both. We have 5 minutes left, and we will split it between Conservatives and Liberals. Mr. Epp for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd like to start with any discussion on fertilizer and reminding everyone that 4 billion people, 1 in 2 in this world, owe their lives and their ability to eat due to fertilizer, in particular the synthetic production of nitrogen. That needs to be kept in mind. We've talked about, and let me add just one other quick fact, which is 3 main elements, macro elements for plant life: nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium. And Canada, from a food security perspective, is blessed to have abundant resources, or the ability to make resources on 2 of those 3. And yet here we are. It's the ultimate irony for me. Here we are talking about shooting ourselves in the foot in 2 of those. So let's take them one at a time. Potassium, right now, because of the 35% tariff. Can you just talk about the cost of rail on top of Saskatchewan potash, the world's leading exporter, into eastern Canada? Is it competitive now with the 35% tariff? What's the market there?
Yeah, we've seen no reduction in competitiveness on potash products or availability. We have historically always supplied the Eastern Canadian region from domestic production. Historically, actually in Nova Scotia, but more predominantly now from Western Canada. So there's been no change in that at all.
In my past life, farming, I've used more Belarusian than Russian potassium on my farm. Unfortunately, Saskatchewan, because of cost reasons. So, in order to look at that longer term, freeing up rails, because potash doesn't flow down a pipeline that well, would that add to the competitiveness of using Canadian potash in Eastern Canada?
Sure, rail is key and critical in terms of being able to supply our market reliably, and so for us, rail is an essential service for supply of fertilizer products. Yes.
Nitrogen, we lack the ability to make it. We certainly don't lack the feedstuffs how do we make more nitrogen in the eastern seaboard where we need it?
There would be a commitment required to invest in domestic nitrogen manufacturing, and I think there are companies that would be interested in pursuing that with the newest available technologies, but that would require the will and support of the various government agencies to help get that off the ground.
I'd love to support going further, but I just want to touch on phosphorus. That's the one that we are short of. Any discussions looking ahead? I know Jordanian phosphorus contains cadmium. That's still okay into Canada, not the EU. So we're dependent on Florida. What's the outlook?
Yes, so for sure there continues to be significant phosphate reserves globally, and so we'll see continued development of those. And without getting into all the number of countries that have phosphate reserves, Canada does itself have phosphate reserves. There's ongoing efforts to develop mines in some regions, northern Quebec as an example, but there wouldn't be enough domestic production, so we will need to rely on imports.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Castra. Maintenant, environ 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. Now 2.5 minutes to Mr. Drouin.
Just obviously the world is changing. There's a lot of things happening, but fertilizer prices have continued to. I mean, we've seen the peak. Obviously, I think all of us heard on October 22, everybody was starting to call us because prices were going through the roof. But since then, I think there's still been a steady decline of fertilizer prices in the market in the world, right? Am I correct to assume
That would be
that?
fair to say in line with many other similar commodities, correct?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I'm just going to make one ask of you, gentlemen. Keep me posted on this, please, on your development with CBSA. I do want to make sure that there's a conclusion, whatever way it goes. That you have there's a conclusion, and then you can do whatever you need to do following the next steps. So I would appreciate that.
Thank you for that.
C'est tout, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
That's all, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Alors,
So thank you to all of our witnesses, Mr. Poisson, Mr. Castra, Mr. Héroux. You really shed some light on this issue this morning. Thank you so much for coming in person. It's very much appreciated when you do that.